ॐ सदाशिवसमारम्भां शङ्कराचार्यमध्यमाम् अस्मदाचार्यपर्यन्तां वन्दे गुरुपरम्पराम् ॐ. So namaste everyone. We are happy to be joined here by Kalavai Venkat ji, and he is the author of the book What Every Hindu Should Know About Christianity. And we're here to discuss this book today, and I'm in the process of almost completing it myself. And it's definitely an imperative read, especially for Hindus, as the title suggests. So the way we're going to do this is that the questions will roughly be divided into 5 sections, which the book covers. And in the end, we'll have a general Q&A from the audience. So, and also in the meanwhile, feel free to interject, as Kalavaiji suggested, that if you have any questions, comments, or require clarifications, we can do it while we are still covering the questions as well. So, let's just begin with the first question. And before that, could you please give us an introduction about what prompted this book and what need does it really fulfill in our society?
Absolutely. First of all, namaste and good morning. Thanks a lot, Prashant, for inviting me on this Google Hangout. And thanks everyone for attending this. And what prompted me to write this book? The first one is I have been writing on matters related to Dharma for more than 15 years now. So I have written books, I have contributed to anthologies, I have written a lot of blogs, a lot of audience for several years, more than 15 years. And even on Christianity, I have been writing for more than 10 years. So in that sense, this book is a continuation of the effort I have been putting into this subject for a long time. What motivated me? If you look at the Samarpana section of my book, I dedicate it to Sitaram Goyal and Koindra Dilst. I consider myself a student in the school of Sitaram Goyal and Koindra Dilst. So the approach they have always taken is a very scientific approach, a very reasonable approach, which is highly consonant with the way traditional Hindus approached other ideologies, other beliefs, or for that reason, any subject. So I'm a very big fan of the Sitaram Goyal and Koindra Dilst school of analysis, and I consider myself a student of that school. And one of the reasons which motivated me to write this book is Sitaram Goyal has written some phenomenal treatises examining Christianity, and that was in the 1980s. And then Koindra Dilst wrote the Psychology of Prophetism, that was written in the 90s. However, there was not a single comprehensive book that touches upon everything, starting from linguistics to philology to neuroscience to reason, leverage all of these tools to examine Christianity comprehensively end to end. So such a book was lacking. I think, if I may argue, such a book is lacking in the marketplace itself. And definitely such a book is lacking from the Hindu perspective. One of the motives for me to write this book. And another reason is, more than a century ago, we had a couple of towering scholars in India. One was Chattampi Swami. He lived in Kerala, and he was a great scholar of Advaita Vedanta. And he wrote a very powerful and critical treatise examining Christianity. And there was another scholar from Tamil Nadu. His name was Arumuga Pillai Navalar. He was a great Shaiva scholar. And he also wrote a highly critical text of Christianity and the Bible in particular. However, those traditional approaches have been few and far between. Some of them have been highly commendable, especially Koindra Dilst, Sitaram Goyal, Ram Swarup, and Chattampi Swami and Arumuga Pillai Navalar, but they have been few and far between. So the way I look at my book is, we have to build upon all of these foundations, but we have to bring in knowledge, cutting-edge knowledge from cognitive science. So for example, there are recent researchers by the scientists and doctors from the Harvard Medical School on the psychology of Jesus. All of those need to be brought in, and we need to update the body of research. So these are the motives for me to write this book.
Oh, that's brilliant. And definitely we can see that it's fulfilling a very deep and pertinent need. So let's begin with the first question, really, starting with the basics. So what exactly is Christianity as it exists in modern society, and how did it evolve from the Old Testament?
All right. So Christianity at the core is an apocalyptic religion. Okay. Apocalypse means waiting for the end of the world. So Christianity prophesies the end of the world, an imminent or the immediate end of the world. Okay. And that is the belief which existed in Christianity nearly 2000 years ago. And that's the belief which is extremely central to Christianity today. So if you were to describe Christianity in a single line, it is an apocalyptic religion. And why did this apocalyptic belief come into existence? So when you go back to around 2200 years, that's a couple of centuries before Christianity was born, Judaism was the predominant religion of what we can call Palestine or Israel. So the Jewish people started writing books like the book of Daniel in the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible. So these books anticipated the return of the Messiah. The reason for that was the Jewish people were subjugated. They were subjugated by a lot of others, by the Assyrians, by the Romans, by a lot of other people. And then they were always having a colonized people status. And they were having this innate urge to fight back and to liberate themselves. And the way they transferred that thought was onto a Messiah. A Messiah means someone who will come and liberate them. So they said a Messiah, a Jewish Messiah will come and he will conquer all the enemies of the Jewish people and he will liberate the Jews. So that is the background for this apocalyptic belief. So these apocalyptic beliefs started, and there were numerous apocalyptic faiths or strands or traditions within Judaism, and Christianity was one of the many that came into existence. So all of these started with the belief that the world is going to end very soon, and hence a Messiah will come. He will selectively save the Jewish people at the expense of everybody else. That was the core of the belief of this apocalyptic thought process. Now, how is Christian apocalyptic belief different from that of the other Jewish apocalyptic beliefs? So Christian belief also added two important aspects to that. One aspect is, it said every person is born in sin. They called it the original sin. Christianity doesn't define it, okay, but then there are enough clues in the Bible and a lot of other Christian traditions as to what it is. It effectively means everyone is a sinner because you are a product of sex. Okay, so a man and a woman, they had a sexual relationship and a child was born, and hence sex is dirty, it's filthy. That's a Christian belief, right? And hence everyone is born in sin. That's what it translates into. Then it also identified who the Messiah is. It said the Messiah who is prophesied in the Jewish Bible or the Old Testament is none other than Jesus Christ. And then it argued that if you accept Jesus Christ as your savior, then you will be cleansed of your sins, and then you will be liberated, or you'll be given salvation, and then you will enjoy that in heaven for eternity. If you do not, then you will suffer. So that in a nutshell is Christianity as it was practiced 2000 years ago and as it is practiced today.
So in many ways, Christianity only fills the gap of the unfulfilled prophecy of the Jews, in a sense.
That's correct. And it also fills and even the Christian prophecy is unfulfilled. Okay, but the entire system is, if I were to give an analogy, which may sound a little bit condescending, but that's not the intent here. So if you go back to the Bible, there are stories, right? There is a story that says there is a talking serpent, right? The snake talks to Eve, right? It talks to Adam and Eve, and then it tells Eve that, don't eat from the tree of knowledge. Now this is very opposite of what we see in Hinduism, but that's not the point I'm getting into. So in Hinduism, the pursuit of jnana and the knowledge is the very core of the dharmic traditions. But let's not go into that. But the interesting point is there is a talking snake, and then this talking snake asks you not to eat from the tree of knowledge, and hence the entire concept of original sin is born out of those stories. Now, if I were to take an analogy, in India, most of us grew up reading a series of books called Chandamama, right? And in Chandamama, you'll have stories where, an elephant or a cobra or, a lot of other animals would be talking to a princess and all of these things. And even a small child, right, even a 6-7-year-old child doesn't take those things literally, okay? We enjoy those stories and then we outgrow those stories, okay? But the entire Bible, in that sense, is very much like a Chandamama-like story, but the Christians took it too literally, okay? Instead of outgrowing that, they said, now let's believe this literally and let's try to live our lives according to this story.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. So apart from the, if I may use the expression, the digestion of Judaism, what are some of the other pagan faiths that were assimilated into Christianity, and Jesus was placed in the center of all of them?
Got it. So I'll start with one clarification here, right? So when we talk of pagan faith, most people think that there was a religion called paganism, right? Which is not true. Okay, what really happened was pagan is a word that comes from Latin pagani. Okay, so pagani means farmers or people who lived in villages, suburbs, etc. Okay, that was by and large a condescending term, right? And like we use the word, a village bumpkin today. Okay, it was somewhat of a similar term, which uh, was used by the city dwellers who had by the time converted to Christianity, and then they called the villagers, the farmers, and other people pagan. However, what we call pagan religions have a lot of similarity to Hinduism. Okay, not in every sense, but in some senses. Okay, uh, in terms of geography, what we call the pagan religions, they covered a broad swath of territory. Okay, starting from the Roman Empire to the ancient Greek world and all the way to Alexandria in Egypt. Okay, and even beyond. But this was a very broad area it covered. And then there were a lot of different belief systems and traditions. So for example, they had a number of gods. Okay, just like we have in Hinduism, we have a lot of devatas. They had many gods, okay, within the pagan religions, and there was not a conflict. Okay, there could be a priest who is a priest of Isis. Okay, there could be a priest who is a priest of Diana. Okay, but there was not a conflict between one and the other. So most of the pagan temples would have altars for many deities. Okay, there, in fact, a very interesting point is they often had altars for the unknown deity. Okay, because we know there could be other gods which we do not know of, and let us set up this altar for this unknown deity, okay, or this unknown god or goddess. Okay, they had that, and very interestingly, Christianity takes advantage of this broad-mindedness and accommodating spirit of the pagan people or the Hellenic people. I call them Hellenic because it was called the Hellenistic world or the Hellenic people. So the Apostle Paul, when he speaks to his audience, he writes, and then he says, look, your own temples have an altar for this unknown God, and this unknown God is none other than Jesus. Okay, so he takes advantage of that, and then he propagates the message. He looks for as foot in the door, and then he uses that to get across to the audience. Now, the pagan people are also extremely liberal, and the pagan kings were also very liberal. So, for example, there was a king in the 4th century. So his name is Julian. So he was called Emperor Julian, and Julian even volunteered to rebuild the Jewish temple that had been destroyed by the Christians and had been destroyed by the Romans. And so Julian volunteered to rebuild those temples. So it was a very accommodating culture. And there was another aspect of the Hellenic traditions, and which was the philosophical aspect, which was in a lot of ways similar to our own Vedantic traditions and other traditions. Even though I won't say it's not an apple-to-apple comparison. Okay, so you had a lot of those philosophers. Of course, every one of us know the names of Socrates or Plato and others, but there were many others. So there was a philosophical system, and there was a very rich tradition of debate, learning, and engaging each other. Okay, so these are the various pagan traditions. Now, a lot of these pagan traditions or the Hellenic traditions had many beliefs, okay, many literary motives, okay, and then they had a lot of traditions which Christianity absorbed. Okay, so Coinrod summarizes a lot of those. Okay, he does a very thorough job of summarizing many of those in his writings, but one of them is the ideas that were inherited from Buddhism and they were incorporated in Christianity. So this may be surprising to a lot of people. How did it get the ideas from Buddhism, right? So there was a very active trade across the Silk Route from India to Central Asia all the way up to the Near East. Okay, and a lot of those ideas flowed into Alexandria and to the Greek Empire. Okay, and they were very familiar with the Buddhist ideas. So Coinrod talks about Buddhist. There are a lot of practices in Christianity. There are a lot of narratives in Christianity. In the Bible, Jesus walks on water, right? And then his disciples are surprised, they are amazed, and then he announces, "It's me." Okay. Then there is another narrative where Jesus says, "Do not judge others," and then there is another narrative in the Bible where Jesus is accepting water from someone who is from a lower strata of society. Okay. All of these stories come from Buddhism. They all come from a text called the Mahanirvana Sutra. Okay, taken from Buddhism and then they are reincorporated into Christianity. Then the tonsuring of the Catholic nuns, right? The Catholic nuns, they shave their heads, they tonsure themselves. And once again, this is a practice which did not come from the pagan religions. It did not even come from Judaism. Okay, where did this come from? This came from the Buddha religion, from Buddhism. Okay, in Buddhism, in the Sangha, in the monastic orders, the nuns, they always tonsured their head. And the monks also, they tonsured their head. That practice came from Buddhism into Christianity. And then you will find the Christians use the rosary when they chant. Okay, so this rosary on the beads, right, chanting on the beads, it once again comes from Buddhism. Okay, so like this, a lot of these features are taken from Buddhism and incorporated into Christianity. And how did this happen? Because there were a section of people called the therapeutic. Okay, that's why we use the word therapeutic, right, which means something which cures. So there were a lot of these therapeutic who were influenced by Buddhism, but who lived in Alexandria and what you can broadly call the Hellenic Empire. They had modeled their school of thought after a lot of Buddhist ideas, and then they were also practicing as doctors, hence they were called therapeutic. And in fact, linguistically, therapeutic comes from Theraputta, a Pali word, okay, which means son of the elder. Okay, in the Sangha, everyone is considered son of the elder. Okay, and hence the word Theraputta, and from there comes therapeutic. Okay, so that's how the idea started flowing. So these people are practicing a lot of ideas they had borrowed from Buddhism and some from Hinduism too, and they were practicing those. And when they all converted to Christianity over a period of couple of centuries, those ideas are incorporated into Christianity, and today they look like Christian ideas. Then if I were to add one more, Coinrodels also talks about the idea of Trinity. So in Christianity, for example, the divine is portrayed as a Trinity, right? The Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Even Christians do not know what that Holy Ghost is. Okay, you can ask the Pope, you can ask anyone, you can read all the books. They do not know what the Holy Ghost means. Okay, and even the idea of Father and Son is extremely confusing. Okay, so because it is also in a way very vulgar, because the Father impregnates the Virgin Mary, and then Jesus is born as her son, and then Jesus says in the Bible, the Father and I are one. Okay, so which means Jesus is a product of an incestuous union with the Virgin Mary, right? But regardless, the concept of Trinity is a very pagan idea. It's an idea very common to the pagan people as well as to the Hindus, the Buddhists, and others, because we always visualize the world in the form of a Trinity, right? So, for example, we have Shiva, Brahma, Vishnu. And then even when you go back to the Vedic times, you have the concept of Indra, Satya, and all of these, right? So you have the concept of Trinity. Okay, so the concept of Trinity was very prevalent among the pagan people, and Christianity borrows these ideas and it incorporates those into Christianity. So the way Christianity digested ideas from others was, first, it will resist an idea if it is a threat to Christianity. Okay, so for example, in the very early parts of Christian history, we do not hear much about the Virgin Mary. Okay, we do not hear about her in the first century that much. But by the time we come to the second and third century, by the time Christianity was on the ascendancy, they were no longer facing a threat from the local pagan religions, because Christianity was on the ascendancy. And especially in the Eastern Empire and along the Mediterranean coast, Christianity was already a dominant religion. And hence they were looking at a goddess of the sea worshipped by the fishermen. Okay, she was called Stella Maris. Okay, and then she is through an inculturation process taken, adapted, and incorporated into Christianity, and eventually she becomes the Virgin Mary. Okay, or in other words, the Virgin Mary of Christianity is given attributes of Stella Maris, incorporated, and hence made appealing to the local people. And this is not only unique, in fact, if I may just add one more thought to that, this is not only unique in the pagan world. Okay, this is very much similar. This process is happening all the time in India too. So, for example, you have the Sahitya Academy Prize winner, Joe D. Cruz, right? So Joe D. Cruz is a Christian by birth, and then he is also a very powerful thinker, and then he narrates how the fishermen of South India were converted to Christianity. And the way they converted was, they knew that all the fishermen worshipped the goddess Kumari. Okay, that's why you have this place called Kanyakumari, right? So they worship the goddess Kumari, and then they always had the belief that goddess Kumari will protect them when they go fishing on the seas or when they go trading in pearls on seas. And then when the Christians converted them to Christianity, they gave all these attributes to the Virgin Mary, and now the story is Vedankani, who is Virgin Mary, and other forms of Virgin Mary will be protecting the fishermen when they go on the sea. So the way they always work is when they find a particular goddess or god or motive a threat to Christianity, they always abuse that god or goddess. But the moment it's no longer a threat, they absorb all of those attributes and practice inculturation incorporated in Christianity, and that's what they did with the pagan cultures too.
That's very crafty. Um, no, this is very insightful because we also often see symbolism of like Jesus being presented as a yogi, and in South
Yeah,
India especially, it's presented as like the 11th avatar of Vishnu. So now I really see the connection between what you're saying, that
yeah,
anytime there's something good in a culture, they digest it, and if they find something incompatible, they'll criticize or abuse it. So,
that's
um,
correct.
another question I wanted to ask about is, could you share some background about Constantine and the Council of Nicaea that led to the Nicene Creed, and just some more thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of misperception or misunderstanding about what Constantine did. Okay, so most people think Constantine was a very fanatical Christian, or that he played a central role in putting together the current version of the New Testament or the Bible, right? None of this is true. So Bart Ehrman, who is one of the leading academics from the University of North Carolina, has written extensively about this. But I'll give a quick summary of this. In short, there was a lot of tussle between the western and the eastern part of the empire. Okay, so in the late 3rd and the early 4th centuries. So in the late 3rd century, there was an occasional persecution of the Christians, not because of religious reasons, but mainly because they were seen as a threat to the empire. Okay, so they would be indulging in insurrections and other activities, or they would not pay obeisance to the king and to the deities, and hence they were seen as a threat. So there was a limited persecution. However, in the eastern part of the empire, there was a very strong Christian population. Eastern part is Constantinople and other places, right? So there was a very, very strong Christian population. So Constantine, like any other king, was also an opportunist, right? He was looking for an opportunity to become the Caesar, okay? And he knew that the eastern part of the empire has a very strong Christian presence, and hence, if he accommodated them, then he is going to get their support and he could grow in strength. So he becomes so he doesn't really become a Christian in the sense we understand it today. Okay, so there were different sects of Christianity at that time, and there was one called the Arian sect. Okay, Arian. Okay, Arian sect. Arian sect, and then Constantine remained a follower of the Arian sect until the end, whereas the rest of the Christians considered that heresy. Okay, so they were opposed to Christianity, or the mainstream Christianity was opposed to that. The Vatican, as we call it today, or the Roman Church, or the Roman bishops were opposed to that. Okay, and that was the sect that Constantine followed. And another thing was Constantine just wanted to settle one thing. He wanted to settle all the bickering and fight among all the Christians, because there are many sects of Christianity, and each one of them would fight the other. And hence he convened the Council of Nicaea, and he said, all of you come together, and then you agree upon what is going to be what is going to form the canon of the Christian religion, right? What all texts will become the canon of the Christian religion. And the way they settled it was they fought with each other, they beat each other up. Okay, it was not an intellectual debate. It was not like a debate between Mimamsaka and the Vedantin or any one of these things. So they were beating each other up. That's the way they did it. Okay, it'll almost look like you were witnessing a scuffle that's going on in the Rajya Sabha today, right? That was the kind of behavior they were all putting up. And Constantine had absolutely no interest in any of those things. And even towards the end of the reign of Constantine, the coins that he printed, they tell us, he was still a worshipper of the sun god. Okay, and he was still paying respect to the sun god. So, in other words, Constantine really did not care much about the Christian theology or about Christianity in the sense a follower would care about, and he was more interested in using Christianity to become powerful as a king. That's all he was interested in. So that's the role Constantine played. However, Constantine was a blessing in disguise for the Christians. The reason was, just before Constantine came to power, the Christians had experienced limited persecution. I use the word limited persecution because there is a myth that Christianity was a persecuted religion all along. That was not true. Okay, the pagan emperors, the Caesars, they never persecuted you for religion. They only persecuted you if you opposed the empire. Okay, so some of the Christians were perceived as not being loyal to the Caesar, and hence they were persecuted. However, when Constantine took over as the emperor, he immediately gave a lot of freedom to the Christians. He supported them with royal funding. He built churches for them, and all of this gave them a foundation from where they could attack the pagan religions, and they could eventually, over the next 40 to 50 years, have all of the pagan religions proscribed or banned, and make it extremely difficult for the pagans to live. So that, in a way, was the blessing in disguise for Christians that Constantine came to power.
And so even the solar god that he worshipped, Sol Invictus, it came to be conflated with Jesus, right, after a point?
Absolutely, because the Christian belief is it's a monotheistic religion. Okay, it accepts the concept of Trinity, but still Jesus is the only God, right? And the Trinity itself is all fused together into one God, and then hence worshipping sun god is completely anti-Christian. But the coins and other things that he was printing, Constantine was still printing those of the sun god.
So what are some of the key points of the Nicene Creed?
So all of that boils down to this, right? And that everyone is born in original sin, and then you get your salvation only by accepting Jesus, and Jesus was born of a virgin, and hence is free from all of the sins. Okay, so in other words, it's a decree, or it's a diktat or a fatwa for telling that Jesus is the exclusivist savior of every one of you, and you are a sinner, and hence if you accept Jesus, then you will be saved, or if you do not, then you will be condemned to hell. Okay, so that's the gist of the Nicene Creed.
So I think it's also important to highlight that they came up with these conclusions as a majority win. So it wasn't through dialectical debates as you suggested, but just it was a statistical outcome of the majority of Christians who ended up like winning that argument or debate. So this is very different from what we are used to, because in our Hindu traditions, you don't come up with truth based on what the majority believes. So I find that also
correct.
Very psychologically different.
Yeah, exactly. So the way I would characterize this, if I were to contrast the two, right, the Hindu way of thinking is very similar to how the scientists would think today, right, or great musicians would think today, right? You don't decide who the greatest musician is. You don't say Tansen was a great musician because everybody raised their hands and they voted for that, right? But those are done, or we say Bala Saraswati is the greatest dancer of the last 2 centuries, not because we did a show of hands. Probably some Bollywood actors would get the vote in that case, right? But we say this because people who are really knowledgeable about Natya Shastra, people who are knowledgeable about dance and music, they do a lot of analysis, they do a lot of discussion, and purely based on technical merit, we say, well, Bala Saraswati was the greatest dancer we had, and or we say Tansen was the greatest musician, or we say Muhammad Rafi was a great singer of the last century. So we come up with all of these things not based on a show of hands, and in that sense, the Hindu tradition is very similar to the scientific, approach, right? Because scientists do not vote as to which is the right theory, which is the right inference. The way they do that is they argue, okay, they qualify their statements, they look for proof, and then they put all of these things together, then emerges a theory out of all of this, right? On the other hand, the entire Christian approach, as in the case of Nicene Creed or in the Council of Nicaea, was all of that was just a show of hands, or it was just mobs coming together, indulging in a slanging match and beating each other up, and saying, look, this is the doctrine that should prevail from henceforth.
I see. So this directly takes me to the next question. Your book talks about cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, and selective attention. So how do they work in the context of practicing Christians?
Absolutely. So what I am going to do is I will start with defining these terms, right? I'm not going to give a textbook definition, but I'll kind of introduce these terms, okay? But I will do all of that using one example, okay? The example I use is the prophecy, okay? So the prophecy of second coming, okay? So in the Bible, Jesus prophecies, he very soon I will return, okay? I am going to die, but when I die, within no time, before the end of your generation, I will return. So a generation is considered to be something around 27 years, and let's be generous, let's give it 30 years. In other words, Jesus said, within 30 years, my second coming would happen, which means I would first die, then I would resurrect, then I would come back, right? I will return in full glory and power. So, so that is the message that Jesus gives out, okay? And now, if you are a Christian, this prophecy was proven false because Jesus did not come back within 30 years. He did not come back within 300 years. He did not come back within a millennium. And 2000 years have passed and Jesus has not come back. And now, if you are a Christian, if you are a faithful person, and if you think that the Bible is the word of God and everything Jesus told is truth, and that you trust Jesus, what would you feel? You will feel a sense of unease when you read this, right? It will put doubt in your mind. Okay, is Jesus telling the truth? Should I be trusting Jesus? So this is called cognitive dissonance. Okay, the feeling of uneasiness that you feel when some of your cherished beliefs is challenged by facts. Some of your cherished beliefs are challenged by reality. So you feel a sense of uneasiness, and that is called cognitive dissonance. And people deal with cognitive dissonance in very different ways. Sometimes they will try to alter their beliefs, but that happens very rarely. Okay, sometimes they will say, oh, there are very honest people, they have done it, and they will read all of these things and they will say, wait a minute, I read the Bible, and hence everything Jesus says is false, and hence I'm no longer a Christian. I alter my belief and then I become a rationalist, okay, or I become a Buddhist, or I become a Hindu. It could be anything. But that happens extremely rarely. Only a very few people do that. But for a lot of people, they have invested a lot because they were born into a family of Christians, okay? And if you no longer remain a Christian, then you pay a big price for that, right? Because your community will shun you, okay? And you may not get your next job, and your family is not going to like you. You may not be able to get married easily, or you may not be able to put your kids in a school that's run by the Christians. So there are a lot of these practical challenges, but even more importantly, at the psychological level, your worldview is in many ways shaped by your religious upbringing. Okay, especially if you're a Christian, those are mostly dogmatic beliefs, and that's how your worldview is shaped. Now, it's very hard for you to renounce all of those beliefs and say, now, henceforth, I'm not a Christian. So what you do is you try to downplay those beliefs. Okay, you try to say, you know what, this could be interpreted differently. Okay, this is not what Jesus said. Okay, and you will do that in a most expedient manner, but it's not necessarily an honest exercise, but that's what you attempt. And the third thing you do is you try to ignore all of those things. Okay, whatever doesn't fit your belief system and whatever challenges you, you try to ignore that. And in fact, there have been studies conducted in neuroscience, where they ran fMRI studies on voters, right? And let's say you are a staunch follower of a politician, and there is this US presidential election, and then you strongly follow this politician, and you are a big fan, and you have committed yourself, and then you run into contradictory statements made by this politician. For a normal person, the rational part of your brain will kick in, and then you will examine, why is this politician making contradictory statements? But the fans and followers of the politician do not do that. What they instead do is, those parts of the brain which process rational thought, they remain inactive. That's what the neuroscientists found. Okay, so these people have a mechanism by which they suppress any verse or any statement or any thought process that challenges their belief. They try to ignore the contradictions and they try to move on. So this is how most people deal with cognitive dissonance. And when they deal with cognitive dissonance, they are also aided and abetted a lot by what you can call Christian apologists. Okay, Christian apologists, they write apologies. Okay, most of them are dishonest. writings, but they are couched in a scholarly language, okay, and then they try to use a very wishy-washy language, and then they build a very elaborate scheme that gives an impression, oh wait a minute, the statement of Jesus appears contradictory, appears to have been falsified, but look at this great scholar. He has his PhD in theology, and he's a professor of religion at Harvard University or some other university, and he has given an explanation, so probably he should be correct. Okay, so so this is called confirmation bias. Okay, so what you do, you look for information that confirms your bias. Okay, your bias is that Jesus is the Son of God, the Bible is the Word of God, and hence everything it says should be correct, and it cannot be contradictory. And when somebody gives you a work of apologetics, then that aids in the process of confirmation bias. Okay, so that allows you to remain snugly ensconced in your childhood belief. Okay, then there is this third concept called selective attention. So selective attention is another concept studied in depth by neuroscientists. Okay, in fact, there is a very interesting video. You can just search on the internet. It's also referenced in my book, where there's a dormitory. There's a college dormitory where a group of kids are playing basketball, right? And then at the beginning, the audience, those who are watching the video, are asked to count, tell the number of times they pass the ball from one to the other with one bounce. Okay, and everybody counts, right? And at the end of it, you ask the audience in a hall, okay, how many times they pass? Everybody will say 12 times, 14 times, 11 times, 18 times. Okay, everybody will come up with a number, right? Then at the end of the day, they ask a question: how many of you noticed a gorilla in the basketball court? Okay, and everybody is now surprised. And now the gorilla is many times larger than the basketball, and even the human beings there, right? Even the players playing there, but nobody noticed it, because that's because our human brain is always tuned to look for information that suits our bias. Okay, that's called selective attention. We always pay selective attention to what we want to confirm and what we want to observe. Okay, and hence these three concepts play a very important role. So now back to how it impacts the Christians. That was your question. How all of these concepts impact the way Christians practice their religion. So anyone who is reading the biblical verse where Jesus says, my second coming is going to happen within a generation, that's within 30 years, would immediately know that Jesus was lying. Okay, they would immediately know that the words of Jesus were proven false. Now what they do is, this will create cognitive dissonance in them. And hence what they try to do is, they come up with, they look for other excuses. Okay, they try to downplay this verse, and they try to ignore this verse altogether, and they look for other verses. And the other verse in Bible says, nobody knows when the second coming of Jesus would happen. Okay, then they quote this verse and they say, aha, look at this. Even though you are all arguing about, he will come back within a generation and all that stuff, that should be a very metaphor-like statement. Okay, it's a figure of speech, and here this verse says nobody knows when the Son of God will come back again. Okay, and then in doing that, they completely ignore the contradiction between the two. And like I pointed out earlier, functional MRI studies conducted by neuroscientists actually tell a part of the brain stops functioning when your religious beliefs are challenged, and this is entirely applicable to the Christians.
I see. That's very insightful explanation.
Yeah.
The book speaks of evidence that indicates that Jesus may not even have existed. So could you shed some more light on that?
Certainly. So to start with, right, in science, we always look for evidence for an assertion. So in other words, if you said, look, there was a nuclear explosion, okay, in my hometown, then the onus of proving it is upon your shoulders. Okay, so in other words, you have to show the seismographic records, right, that tell, hey, wait a minute, there was an explosion, and look at the surge in the seismographs. Okay, so and hence there was a nuclear explosion. And if you do not find any such evidence, the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence of phenomenon, right? In other words, if there is no seismographic spike, it means there was no nuclear explosion in your hometown, right? So to start with, there is no positive evidence that Jesus existed. There is absolutely none. Okay, and the only reason the historicity of Jesus was taken for granted all these years was because history was written by Christians, and Christians believed Jesus existed, and hence they propagated and they reinforced that belief time and again. And since a majority of people subscribe to this belief and still continue to subscribe to that belief, and this belief survives in the world. But apart from that, there has never been any positive evidence for the existence of Jesus. That's number one. Then number two, there were a lot of historians and scribes and chroniclers who documented about what went on in the Roman world, the Greco-Roman world, as well as in Palestine. Okay, they described everything in detail, and none of them who would have been a contemporary of Jesus, who lived, starting from around, 15 or 20 AD, all the way up to 80 or 90 AD, none of them talks about Jesus. Now, none of them is even aware of the existence of Jesus, even though if you read the Bible, Jesus was a phenomenal person, right? He was doing miracles, he was challenging the authority, he was challenging the Romans, and he was doing all kinds of things, and he was challenging the Jewish orthodoxy. He does everything, and he attracts so much attention that Pontius Pilate has to have him crucified. Okay, he was such a big revolutionary, right? It's like Bhagat Singh or Madan Lal Dhingra or Mahatma Gandhi or any one of these people. And now, if I were to give an analogy, if someone were to look at the newspapers of the 20th century, right, from 1900s to 1947, 1948, and since all of these people were considered freedom fighters by the Indians, and they were considered as dangerous extremists or enemies of the empire by the British, so when you look up the British newspapers as well as the Indian newspapers, you would find a lot of references to these freedom fighters. Okay, the only difference is Indians would be praising a Bhagat Singh or a Madan Lal Dhingra or a Vanchinathan Iyer. Okay, whereas the British would be abusing them. They will call them terrorists. Okay, but there will be enough evidences. When you go through the archives of the newspapers, you'll find a lot of evidence. Now, if Jesus was really such a dangerous revolutionary that he had to be crucified, okay, and he was an enemy of both the Jewish orthodoxy and Pontius Pilate, who was the governor on behalf of Caesar, then you should find a lot of references. You find none. Okay, and hence here the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. That's number one. Then number two, Professor G.A. Wells analyzes all the texts that were written at that time, and he summarizes every reference, and then he comes to a very comprehensive conclusion that there is no historical trace of the existence of Jesus. Then there was a University of Berkeley professor called Alan Dundes. Okay, he looks into all the folklore and the way the gods and goddesses are portrayed, not only in Palestine but also in the Greco-Roman world. Okay, so he looks for, I think, like 24 or 25 such attributes that were used to characterize a divine person. So these attributes include things like a god is always born of a virgin, a god is resurrected 3 days after he dies, and all of these things, right? A god is crucified or killed, and all of these things. So he finds Jesus shares 22 of the 25 attributes with other divinities of the pagan world. Okay, in other words, if all the other divinities of the pagan world were mythical characters, there is no need to assume that Jesus was anything but a mythical character. Okay, but the most compelling evidence for all of these comes from a contemporary scholar called Richard Carrier. He's an American scholar, and he has written 2 exceptionally good books, and I'll make an exception and just cite the name of those 2 books. Right, one book is called Proving History, Bayes' Theorem and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. The second book is On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt. These are the 2 books, and these 2 books, Richard Carrier comprehensively analyzes all the evidence available, and then most importantly, he takes a very scientific approach. He takes the statistical method of Bayes' theorem to evaluate the evidence, and then he comes up with the conclusion that Jesus probably did not exist. Okay, so the long story short, there is no evidence for the existence of Jesus, and Jesus shares the attributes of every other mythical character that existed in that point in time in the Greco-Roman world, as well as something the Palestinians are familiar with. And so in all conclude that Jesus did not exist and he was just a mythical character.
I see. That does make a lot of sense. And the next question I have to ask is about Conrad Elst. So he is cited in your book, and he makes a conclusion that Jesus, if at all he existed, may be suffering from some form of paraphrenia. And in another section of your book, you also refer to Jesus as a psychotic messiah, possibly. So could you shed more light on these conclusions as well?
Definitely. So the book you are talking about is The Psychology of Prophetism, right, written by Conrad Elst. Conrad Elst wrote this book in 1990s. So in this book, Conrad Elst leverages the researches of Herman Sommers. Herman Sommers was a Belgian scholar. Okay, so Herman Sommers had a great advantage. He was a Christian priest and a theologian, and he was also a trained psychologist. So what he did was he had the unique advantage of looking at all the evidence in the Bible, okay, all the narratives attributed to Jesus, all the words of Jesus, and then evaluate it not only as a theologian but also as a trained psychiatrist. And then he comes to a very interesting conclusion saying that Jesus was psychotic. Okay, so he suffered from mental illness, and he calls that mental illness paraphrenia. And Conrad Elst, builds on this, and then he comes up with a very comprehensive thesis. So what is this paraphrenia? This paraphrenia is characterized by grandiose delusions. Okay, so you have delusions that you are son of God, or some of very you are a person of very cosmic proportions, right? That's the kind of delusion you have. Then this is characterized, and Jesus displays a lot of those delusions, and because he thinks of himself as son of God. And there are a lot of resentment. Okay, if a person suffers from paraphrenia, he carries a lot of resentment towards others. And even in the Bible, if you look at it, Jesus is very resentful of his own mother, okay, the Virgin Mary, because there is one place where Jesus is allegedly very precocious, right? He's like 12 years old or something, and then he's sitting with a lot of Jewish Pharisees and others. Those are the Jewish Orthodox scholars, and he's debating with them. And then the Virgin Mary goes over and he says, "What are you doing here?" And Jesus says, "Don't you know that I'm here to do my Father's bidding?" Okay, meaning God's bidding, right? So he's very resentful towards the Virgin Mary, and he also uses a very condescending term to address her. "Hey woman." Okay, he doesn't call her affectionately as mother or anything, and he's very resentful. He calls her "Hey woman." Okay, so he's very resentful, and he's also highly secretive. Okay, so Conrad summarizes a lot of those cases, and he tells others, "Don't tell the rest of the world what I am telling you now." Okay, so these are all very typical attributes of someone suffering from paraphrenia, and both Herman Sommers and Conrad Elst do a comprehensive analysis, and they come to a conclusion that Jesus suffered from paraphrenia, which is a form of psychosis, and which is also characterized by a very underlying sexual tension. Okay, so if you're sexually very abnormal, right, and then you suffer from some kind of a sexual deficiency, then that's also one of the characteristics of a paraphrenic. And throughout the Bible, as well as in other Christian texts, and even both the texts that are accepted by the Orthodoxy and those that were rejected by the Orthodoxy, all kinds of texts, you find an underlying tension relating to sexuality in Jesus. Okay, so, and Jesus does not like sex. Okay, he considers it filthy. So for example, there is a book called Acts of Thomas, where there is a wedding, right? There's a wedding happening, and the groom enters the nuptial the bride's room, right? So the bridegroom enters the bride's room on the nuptial night, and then he is surprised to find right next to the bride on the nuptial bed, Jesus is sitting there. Okay, and then Jesus is advising her. Okay, Jesus is telling, "Look, sex is filthy. Okay, if you avoid sex altogether, okay, and then if you don't have children and all these things, then you will make it to heaven." Okay, so, and this is something you find throughout. Okay, even the Apostle Paul gives out similar messages. He says, it's better to avoid sex altogether, but if it is completely inevitable, then get married. Okay, so you'll find that even in India, someone like Gandhi embraced these thoughts. Okay, those are not Hindu thoughts. Okay, in Hinduism, dharma, artha, kama, moksha, all the four are very important. Kama is sacred sexuality, and in fact, in Hinduism, a married couple should satisfy each other. It's a mandatory thing. Okay, and then we wrote a lot of Kama Shastras that were used to educate Hindus. If you go to any temple, you will find a lot of erotic sculptures that are meant to educate the people. And also even in Bharatanatyam and other dance forms, and even in classical music, there will be a lot of compositions that talk freely about sexuality. Okay, there is no shame in sex, and instead Hinduism elevated sexuality to the level of sacred, whereas in Christianity it was considered filthy. So in the utterings and narratives attributed to Jesus, you will find a lot of sexual tension. Okay, so all of these things are signs of paraphrenia. Now, I think increasingly the research of Coinrod Elst and Herman Sommers is being confirmed. Recently, from the Harvard Medical School, a panel of neuropsychiatrists, they conducted a comprehensive research into the words and deeds of Jesus as narrated in the Bible. And this team was led by a scientist called Evan Murray. And then they published, it was a peer-reviewed research. Okay, they compared everything with the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, which is used for, by all the neuropsychiatrists in the United States to examine the patients. And they examined Jesus, and they came to the conclusion that he was most likely psychotic. Okay, which actually confirms the thesis of Coinrod Elst. Now, those who are watching this video may be a bit confused, right? Because only a few minutes ago I said Jesus probably did not exist. And then now I am also summarizing the thesis that says Jesus was probably psychotic. Okay, how is it possible? How can the two reconcile with one another? I discuss this in my book. Okay, so to make it abundantly clear, Coinrod Elst thinks that Jesus existed. Okay, he said, look, all of these words and deeds attributed to this person implies that there was a historical kernel to that. Okay, so probably a Jesus existed, and that Jesus suffered from paraphrenia. Okay, that is in a gist the thesis of Coinrod Elst. Okay, and the Harvard neuropsychiatrists started the assumption. Okay, they say, look, we are not going into the historicity of Jesus. What we are doing is we are examining the Jesus of the New Testament. Okay, assuming he existed, okay, as a historical person, and then we come to this conclusion that he was psychotic. But how can we reconcile my argument that he probably did not exist and the likelihood that he was psychotic? I discuss this in my book. So where I explain a lot of religious sects which are doomsday cults, right? Which say, look, the world is going to end very soon. Okay, there is going to be the second coming of the Messiah. The Messiah is going to kill all of our enemies, and then he'll put us on a heaven-bound cargo where we'll go there and we'll enjoy our life for eternity. I don't know why it is going to be enjoyment, because there is no sex in heaven, right? And most likely there are no females in heaven either, because according to the Bible, only 144,000 people would make it to heaven, and all of them have to be virgin males. Okay, and that means there are no females, there is no sex, nothing of fun in heaven. And I don't know why you would want to go there, but that's a different story, right? But a lot of Christians want to go to that heaven. Those kind of doomsday cults, right, which prophesy the immediate end of the world, they attract a lot of people who are called functional schizotypes. Okay, functional schizotypes are people have mental issues, they have psychotic issues, but those are not very pronounced. So that does not prevent them from operating in a way normally, if not perfectly normally, reasonably normally in a society. Okay, so but these kind of cults attract such people. So I put forth the possibility that early Christianity attracted a lot of these people. They came together, and then they wrote prophecies. Okay, and then they took this mythical character called Jesus. Okay, and then they embellished that character. They kept on attributing words and deeds to that character. But since all of these were written by those who are functional schizotypes, you find all signs of psychotic people. Okay, all signs of a psychotic Jesus. Okay, in the New Testament. Okay. So all of this is explained at length in my book, and I bring up evidence of similar cults, right? Even in contemporary times, there are cults in Brazil and other places, and you know, you have all heard of all this, you know, heavens what is called the one where they committed suicide because they wanted to go on a comet when Halley's comet came, and all of these cults existed even today, even in recent times. And so I discuss all of these at length in my book. But in a nutshell, Christians are left with only two choices. Okay, choice A, they accept that Jesus did not exist. He's just a mythical character, and hence there is no reason for them to be Christians. Or accept the possibility if he existed, then he was a mental patient. Okay, and I don't use it in a derogatory sense, right? I think mental illness is something which is terrible, and a mental patient suffers a lot, right? And then not only the patient but also the family suffers, and most of society does not understand what it is to be a mental patient, right? What it is to be a schizophrenic or a paraphrenic or a psychotic person, and most of society makes fun of that person or is completely apathetic. So I think a person who suffers from mental illness deserves our sympathy. And in that sense, if Jesus existed and if he was suffering from mental illness, he deserves our sympathy, right? And I think today, if Jesus were to live in the United States of America, he will get free treatment under Obamacare, okay, in a good psychiatric ward, okay? And I think that's something we should all support, okay? And I would entirely support that. But I find it extremely ridiculous when Christians don't recognize this. And if Christians said, look, let's use Jesus as an example, and he suffered from a mental illness, and we are not going to claim he is son of God, but let's use that example to take free Obamacare to psychiatric patients all across the US and even across the world. I would support that, right? I would welcome that. But if they say, look, every telltale sign of a psychotic person is here, and then you call him the son of God, that's my problem.
Makes total sense. Absolutely. My next question is that are there any dire consequences promised for non-believers of Christianity who do not take Jesus as a savior?
There are. Okay. So Christianity is pretty much the outcomes are binary. Okay. So let's start the contrast, right? So within Hinduism, you have many schools, right? There are darshana, which are Ishvara Darshana, right? And then they accept the concept of Ishvara, okay? And there are Bhakti traditions, and then there are schools of Vedanta, okay, where it accommodates Bhakti, it also accommodates knowledge, right, Jnana. But then at one stage it says you have to transcend everything to attain moksha. Then you have Nirishwara Darshana within Hinduism, right? So Nirishwara Darshana is not necessarily atheism, right? And I practice Nirishwara Darshana, but lot of traditions, like starting from Lokayata all the way up to Nyaya or even Vaisheshika, or in a sense Nirishwara, because the existence of Ishvara is not a requirement or central or a prerequisite to establishing those schools, those darshana, right? And hence they are called Nirishwara, right? So that's why Mahabharata even considers Sankhya to be a Nirishwara darshana, right? So now in Hinduism, you have these different schools, and then if you don't follow something, what happens? Nothing, okay? Because it's not as if, look, you don't accept Adi Shankara, or you don't accept Ramanuja, or you don't accept Kapila, you go to hell. Nothing of that sort, right? So if you accept, fine, okay, there are no rewards. Actually, there are no rewards if you seriously think of it, right? Because once you attain knowledge, right, and once you overcome avidya, what do you get? You get nothing, because you attain moksha, and then in paramarthika, which is the transcendent reality, there is nothing, okay? You don't exist anymore, right? And your ego does not exist, and there is no duality, okay? And in every sense, in Hinduism, there are no material beliefs, okay? It's not like Islam, where they say, look, you blow yourself up and you go to the Islamic heaven, you get 72 virgins, okay? And it's not like in Christianity, where you are told, look, you go to heaven and you get to enjoy for rest of your life, okay, or for rest of eternity. There's no such thing in Hinduism, okay? So pursuit of knowledge or pursuit of a philosophy is only to liberate yourself from ignorance, okay? That is the core of Hindu approach. And if you don't, nothing will happen, okay? You will again, based on your karma, you may spend a short time in heaven or hell, and you will again come back, you'll be reborn, and you'll again marry, you'll have fun, again you will die, okay? This cycle, samsara, will just continue. But in Christianity, the outcomes are very binary, okay? If you accept Jesus, you will go to heaven. If you don't, Jesus will, upon his second coming, slaughter every one of you, okay? Every one of the non-believers. That includes all of children, okay? They may be perfectly reasonable children, and they may be doing the nicest things one can think of, okay? but they would all be slaughtered by Jesus. They would not merely be slaughtered. He would torture them. This is what the Bible tells us. He would torture them for 5 months on earth. Okay, that will be a brutal torture, and then he will kill them. Then he will load them on the hell-bound cargo post-mortem. Okay, where he will take them to hell, and in hell he would torture them for eternity, and they'll be burnt in fire, and all kinds of things will happen. Right? All of this sounds very childish, but this is what the fundamental Christian belief is. And the so-called Christian philosophers, I use the word so-called because I consider them all to be extremely substandard, right? And most of them won't even get a D, right, in a Hindu school of philosophy. But someone like, Thomas Aquinas, okay, he is hailed as a great philosopher, and I, mercilessly critique him in the book. And then someone like Thomas Aquinas says one of the greatest advantages of being a Christian is that when you die, you will go to heaven, and then you can sit in the balcony of heaven, and from there you can derive great pleasure by watching all of these non-believers getting tortured in hell. Okay, and if this is not sadism, I do not know what is. Okay, but so what Christianity promises believers is a sadistic pleasure, and what it promises non-believers is eternal torture. So this is what is in store for non-believers like us, all of us Hindus and Buddhists and atheists and everyone. Now, you may ask, why do we even take this seriously? Because earlier I said the entire Bible reads like a Chandamama comic, right? So why do we have to even take this seriously? That's very true, right? All of this is a nonsensical belief. Okay, we can just ignore that. But for a very important lesson, history teaches us. So the Bible told very similar things about the Jewish people. Okay, so it said they are all children of devil. Okay, and it said every generation of Jews are cursed. Okay, because they killed Jesus. Okay, it told all these stories. Now Christians internalized all of these stories, and then they subjugated and they ill-treated the Jews for nearly 2000 years. And those who were brought up in the Christian tradition, like Adolf Hitler, okay, and the Nazis, okay, Hitler not only quotes Jesus, he finds Jesus to be a great inspiration, and then he repeatedly works closely with the Vatican and the Christian churches, and then he subsidizes the Bible, he subsidizes the writings of Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, and then he distributes all over the place. And then his propagandists like Julius Streicher, they take biblical themes and then they compose them in songs and rhymes for nursery school children. They teach all these things, and we know what came out of it. 6 million Jews were exterminated on earth. And then this is not the only crime of Christianity. So what it did to the gypsies. So the gypsies are, it's a very denigrating term, by the way, right? The correct term to use is Roma, right? So the Roma people are Hindus. They came from India. Okay, so they came from what we call the Punjab and Haryana region of India today. And then they migrated, they were taken as slaves by the Muslims when the Muslims came and conquered India, and they sold them into slavery in Armenia, Iraq, and other places, and eventually they made it to the Europe. Both the Christians and the Muslims, they indulge in slave trade of the Roma people or the Gypsy people. And the Christians compiled really slanderous rhymes and Christmas carols about the gypsies, right? They wrote songs like the gypsies were ironsmiths, right? The blacksmiths, right? They used to work on iron. And then they told stories like the gypsies made the iron that was used to crucify Jesus, and hence they have to do penance. And as a result of that, the gypsies or the Roma people were repeatedly persecuted, and more than 500,000 of them were exterminated by the Christian Nazis when Hitler sent them all to the gas chambers. So this is the problem, right? And now I always give this analogy. Let's say you have a neighbor, right? And then every day the school bus comes to pick up your daughter, right? And your daughter is a 5-year-old kid. She goes to first grade or kindergarten or whatever it is. And then your neighbor comes out and then he says, "Hey man, I wish your daughter breaks her leg today, and then she comes back home in crutches." Okay, let's say he says this every day when your daughter is boarding the school bus. What would you do? You are not going to keep quiet, right? You will go and challenge him. You will go and engage him. You'll ask him, "Why are you saying this to my daughter? This is the meanest thing to say. Okay, why are you wishing ill for my child? Okay, is something mentally wrong with you? Okay, or are you just a mean person? Would you change your ways?" And if he says, "No, I will not change my ways," then you will go and tell your daughter, look, we have this neighbor who's a sick fellow. Okay, he wishes ill for you. Okay, now stay away from him. Okay, he is not your friend. He will never be your friend. Stay away from him. That's exactly the same we should do to the Christians, right? If Christians believe all this nonsense written in the Bible, and then we face two risks, right? One is there is a possibility that non-Christians may suffer the plight of the Jews and Gypsies or the Roma people, and the second one is they are also indulging in hypocrisy, right? To your face, they are saying, hey, you know what, you are my friend, okay, and you and I can coexist. But behind your back, they are wishing that your daughter and your son will burn in hell for eternity, whereas they will watch from the balcony of heaven the suffering of your child for eternity. So how is this acceptable? No civilized person, no civilized society should accept that, and that's why this is what is in store for non-believers. Okay, if anything that Christianity says is true, but even if what it says is completely untrue, which I think it is, whatever Jesus and the Bible and the Christians' prophecy for us and our children is obscene and indecent, and hence we should not tolerate it.
That is indeed very insightful, and so this actually addresses one of the questions I had about how one should engage a Christian in dialogue and debate. So this covers that. So thank you for that as well. And now the elephant in the room, really. So despite these philosophical, metaphysical, psychological, and ethical inconsistencies with the Dharmika traditions, why are so many Hindus in favor of Christianity and show Jesus the respect that they do?
So if I were to answer that in a single line, my answer would be it's the ignorance of the colonized mind. Okay. So if you go back to history, Christianity came to India sometime in the 6th century. Okay, it was brought by the traders to Kerala. So what you find, Hindus accommodated them. Hindus said, all right, you are just like any other religion, come and live here, no problem, right? So, and the Christians flourish. So they are called the Syrian Christians or the Indian Orthodox Church of Kerala. Okay, so Hindus never bothered with them, right? In fact, they let them flourish. Okay, but Hindus showed no interest in Jesus. Okay, because Jesus offered nothing that Hindu gurus, Hindu rishis and Hindu philosophical texts offered in abundance. Okay, there was nothing Jesus could offer that we did not have, and in fact, if they had bothered to read the Bible, they would have found a lot of it to be, to be really sickening. But throughout, you had a lot of debates across the darshana, but mostly Hindus simply ignored Christianity because it offered nothing of interest to us. And all of this changed only in the 19th century when the British were ruling us, and some of our elite Hindu children were taken to convent schools and educated there. A lot of this trend starts with Raja Ram Mohan Roy and others, right? And they got completely brainwashed by the Christians in the Christian schools, and then they internalized almost a fulsome respect and praise for Jesus. Okay, and they would go about praising Jesus everywhere, and then they saw Jesus as the fulfillment of Hinduism. Okay, and so they wouldn't let go of everything, right? Because they also liked aspects of Vedanta and other things in Hinduism, but they cannot let go of that. And then they had now acquired a love for Jesus, and so they concluded that Jesus is the icing on the cake. Okay, Vedanta is the cake and Jesus is the icing. Okay, and then we had a lot of Hindu gurus, right? And while I don't mean this in a disrespectful sense, right? So a lot of Hindu gurus like Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Swami Vivekananda, Sivananda, Prabhupada, and others. They have all done some phenomenal work. Okay, I'm not going to discount any of that. Okay, so they have taken Hinduism across the world, and then they have countered other religions, Christianity, Islam, etc. in many places. I admire all of those things, but I think in the spirit of inquiry, we should also criticize where it is due. Okay, so a lot of these people were also brainwashed. Okay, so many of them had attended Christian schools and other things in their childhood, and then they had not really read the Bible, and then they had not really understood what Christianity was. And then since in the schools, the Christian missionaries taught them a very sanitized version of Jesus, and Gandhi, all of these people, they did that, right? So they were all taught a sanitized version of Jesus, and then they internalized it. And then they would go about praising Jesus in their sermons, in their lectures, etc. And as a result, their followers started praising Jesus too. So today, that's why you find among the westernized secularized Hindus, okay, they all have a complete respect for Jesus. And the moment you criticize Jesus, okay, you can offer all the facts in defense of your criticism. Okay, they won't look at the fact, and you all already know the reason, right? Cognitive dissonance, and why they behave that way. Okay, instead they will immediately say, oh, you must be a Hindu fanatic, that's why you're criticizing Jesus, and I have no problem accepting Jesus on the one hand, and then accepting Hinduism on the other. But the problem is the two cannot coexist, okay, because Christianity says if you are not a Christian, if you do not accept Jesus as your exclusive savior, then you will go to hell. Okay, and it doesn't accommodate. Look, you can go and worship Krishna in the morning and Jesus in the afternoon. I'm not saying you should do that, but all I'm pointing out is, Christianity doesn't have this kind of accommodation, and it's only our own Hindu swamis and some of the Hindu thinkers who have been doing this kind of stuff. However, I must point out this was not the way it was initially, right? I pointed out until the early 1800s, Hindus were very critical. I mean, Hindus totally ignored Christianity. They were not praising Jesus. And towards the end of the 1800s, we had some towering Hindu spiritual leaders, right, or religious leaders like Chattampi Swami and Arumuga Navalar. So they wrote scathing criticism of Christianity. Chattampi Swami wrote a book called Christu Mata Chedanam, okay, meaning dissection of the Christian religion, right? And then if you read it today, it will look like, there is an English translation available, it's available online, okay? And then it will look like it was written in 2015. It's that modern, okay? And then he uses all the modern techniques or everything that he had at his disposal to attack, ridicule, and reduce Jesus to dust, okay? So that's the way it was. And then you had Arumuga Pillai Navalar. He wrote a book called Shaiva Dushana Parigaram, okay? So the remedy for an abuse of the Shaiva religion. So he was a Shaiva scholar, okay, and he was a Shaiva religious leader. And the Christian missionaries used to abuse Shaivism in particular. And hence, he wrote this critique, launching a blistering attack on the Bible and Christianity. Now, what happened was that trend could have continued. Okay, a lot of our Hindus could have picked up from where Chattampi Swami and Arumuga Navalar left, and then they could have offered an even more nuanced critique, updated that with modern knowledge from philology, linguistics, science, etc., and decimated Christianity. Unfortunately, thanks to Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, Vivekananda, and many other Hindu Swamis and Gandhi and others, they ignorantly and almost mindlessly went about praising Jesus, left, right, and center. And since these people, today, very few Indians or Hindus would know of Chattampi Swami or Arumuga Navalar, right? Except those who are, pursuing scholarly works. Others won't even know of them, but everybody would know of Vivekananda or Gandhi or Sivananda. And hence, everybody says, look, if Jesus was good enough for Gandhi, Sivananda, and Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Vivekananda, then he is good enough for me. But that to me is an extremely lazy answer. Okay, it's also a logical fallacy. It's an argument from authority, right? You simply say I accept something because someone powerful, someone famous said that, and that's a very lazy, that's a very un-Hindu way of thinking. The correct Hindu way of thinking is to look for evidence, right? That's why when you go back to old texts like Gautama Nyaya Sutra, even for Shabda Pramana, it says it should be treated like an expert opinion, which should be verified against evidence. Okay, that was the traditional Hindu approach. Unfortunately, a lot of modern Hindus, and they take the intellectually lazy approach to praising Jesus because it's a path of least resistance.
Very well said. And I have one final question. We often see the argument, especially from the secular Hindu front, that if Christianity is so bad, then why are there good Christians? So how do you address that?
All right. The question is, if Christianity is so bad, then why do we have good Christians, right? Or the corollary is, if there are good Christians, then Christianity should be good. Okay, that's the corollary of this argument, right? So we can simply refute this argument with a counterpoint, right? If Nazism and Hitler are so bad, why do we have good Germans? Right? Because every one of us will agree that even when Hitler lived, there were many good Germans, right? And definitely we can all say that all the German children were good people, okay, because they had not yet been conditioned by the Nazi ideology. And does the presence of good Germans make Nazism a good ideology? It does not. Okay, so in logic and in mathematics, we call it fundamental attribution error. Okay, so what it does, it attributes the goodness or the lack thereof of a particular ideology to some factor which is completely unrelated, right? Now, the presence of people, the presence of good people in a society does not mean that every ideology in that society is good. Okay, why is that? Because no ideology can corrupt everyone 100%. Okay, it can corrupt you 20%, it can corrupt you 30%, or it can corrupt 10% of the population and not the remaining 90%. Okay, this is the nature of any ideology. This is how information flows, right? And hence, in any society, even which has the worst possible ideology, like Stalinism or Nazism or Christianity or Islam or anything, you will still find enough good people. And in fact, if you were to selectively cherry pick evidence, you can even write a complete book, right, that will portray the society as made up entirely of good people. Okay, and in fact, you can do this even with Mein Kampf, right, the book that Hitler wrote, and you can cherry pick sentences, and you can create a book that will look like, that will make Hitler look like a great person, a very humble person, a connoisseur of art and architecture, and not at all an anti-Semitic monster he was, right? So, but the problem is, we do not need 100% of the people to be 100% influenced by an ideology for that ideology to harm society. Okay, take Islam today. Nobody will say 100% of Muslims are terrorists. They are not. Okay, nobody will say 100% of Muslims are jihadis. They are not, right? But the presence of a few jihadis and the presence of a few Muslims who are ready to die and become fidain or suicide bombers is enough to pose a significant threat to any society. Okay. Likewise, a presence of a small core who embraced the Nazi ideology and who were ready to go to full extent, right, to persecute the Jewish people and send them to the gas chambers was good enough to kill 6 million Jewish people. Likewise, the presence of a small core of Christians who were fanatics and who believed the Bible and the words of Jesus was good enough to persecute Jews and eventually to kill 6 million of them. That was good enough to persecute the Roma people or the Gypsies and to kill nearly 500,000 of them when Hitler came to power. And that was enough for them to persecute and kill a lot of Indians. They killed a lot of both men, women and children in 1857, right, when the Hindus put up launched a struggle for independence. So this was good enough for them. So that is why the correct answer to give is, look, no ideology can corrupt anyone 100%. So even in a society which is governed by the worst possible ideology, you will find good people. But the presence of good people does not validate the goodness of an ideology. So we should be able to evaluate the two independently, because a bad ideology, even with a small dedicated core, can do significant harm to society.
Very true. And most people ignore the 1,000 years of conquistadors and inquisition of Christianity. So they usually see the peaceful side of, Plato's Jesus, go to heaven, help
Right.
thy neighbor, and so on. But they actually miss out on the entire historical aspect of how violent Christianity has been. So I guess one of the ways to
Exactly.
summarize your argument would just be to say that there are good Christians in spite of Christianity.
Precisely. That's the right answer, because human beings are complex systems, right? We are all complex system. For example, all of us do not like one form of beauty, right? A woman I find beautiful, you may not, or a woman or a man, one of our discussants here finds handsome, another woman may not, right? Because we are complex beings, and as complex beings, as complex systems, we are also influenced by an idea to varying degrees, right? Some of us are blind followers, some of us are not, some of us are influenced to 10%, 30%, 40%. So as you correctly said, some Christians are good in spite of Christianity and not because of it.
So on that note, I would like to conclude my questions, and I thank Kalavai Venkat ji for this very insightful interview, and of course for writing a spectacular book. So if you could just give a final note on where people can make this purchase, because as a person living in the US, I could buy it on Amazon.com or Lulu.com. But what about people who live in India?
So it's also available on Amazon India, okay, on the website, and also there is another publisher in India called Pothi, okay, POTHI, I think, and they also bring it out, and that's a lower cost edition. So you have that available in India as well. And Rajiv Verma from the Global Hindu Institute, who organized the writing of this book and who commissioned this, he is also trying to bring out more easily accessible, a mass version available in India.
Wonderful. So we look forward to that. And on that note, I'll just close up with a Shanti mantra and then open it up for the audience. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate Om Shanti 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 Hariḥ Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Hariḥ Om. So if anyone has any questions for Kalavai, please go ahead and we can have that session.
Yeah, I have a question. Hello?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for the session. It was really very, very insightful, and I think I learned a lot. In fact, a lot of questions also got answered. I just had a question in mind as to what does Christianity say about sins other than those by virtue of birth? I mean, you said that Christianity would define us as sinners by virtue of the way we are born. But how about the other deeds? How about the negative things, or maybe if a person is indulging in negative things, what is it that is prophesied for people who are indulging in things other than these sins?
That's a great question, right? I'll quickly summarize your question for the benefit of everyone. So your question was, Christianity designates you as a sinner, designates everyone as a sinner because you are all born, you are allegedly born in original sin, right? As a result of having product of sex. So, but what does Christianity say about those who commit sinful or noble deeds or virtuous deeds, right? And in other words, the question is, does your conduct have any impact at all on whether you would go to heaven or hell? Is that a good summary? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's a great question, right? So in fact, your conduct absolutely means nothing in Christianity. So the reason for that is Christianity has an idea called predestination. Okay. According to predestination, you are predestined to go to heaven or hell. Okay. So this is a very interesting idea. Okay. So in other words, what it says is, in fact, this is one of the fatal flaws of Christianity. Okay, so you don't need anything outside of Christianity to discredit that religion. Okay, their theological premise itself invalidates that religion. So Christianity says God has predestined you to either go to heaven or hell. Okay, so in other words, everything you do, whether you are born in original sin or whether you have done something good, a virtuous deed, or whether you have done a sinful crime, makes no difference. Okay, because God has predestined you to go to heaven or to hell. Now, can God change his mind? Right. So I address all these questions in the book. Now, what happens? God changes his mind. Then that makes the God less omnipotent and less omniscient. Okay, because which means before you were born, God thought that you would go to heaven. Okay, and hence, but after you were born and because you did something, God changed his mind. Now let us send her to hell. That means the originally what God had in mind for you has been proven false, right? So that means God is not omniscient. So Christianity grappled with this problem initially, very interestingly, right? They came up with an idea called free will. Okay, so by your own free will, you can accept Jesus. Okay, and hence you will go. But the problem is your free will and predestination both cannot be true. Only one of them can be true, because if you are predestined by God to go to hell, but out of your own free will you have accepted Jesus as your savior and you go to heaven, that means whatever God predestined for you has been proven false, right? So the two cannot be true, and hence in other words, if you are predestined to go to heaven or hell, why do you even have to believe in Jesus? You don't have to believe in Jesus, because anyway you are going to heaven or hell one way or the other. Okay? Now stepping outside of this, do your deeds matter? In Christianity they do not. Okay, you could be the worst sinner, But if you accept Jesus as your savior, or if you are predestined to go to heaven, then you will go to heaven. Okay. On the other hand, if you have not accepted Jesus and you have done the most noble deeds, right? And let's say you trained as an oncologist and then you dedicated your life to saving children dying of cancer, right? And then you never kept any money for yourself, and then you trained another 100 doctors in your life. All of them, they dedicated their lives. You created a movement, and that was so beneficial to children, and you did the most noble things. Makes no difference. Okay, despite doing all of these things, you would still go to hell if you did not accept Jesus as your savior. In other words, Christianity is not a religion that rewards virtuous behavior. It's a religion that rewards dogmatic submission to Jesus. In many senses, that is very similar to how the terrorists like ISIS or Osama bin Laden operate today. If you think of it, they tell a woman, if you wear the burqa or the veil head to toe, and then if you obey the orders of the terrorist organization and go and kill, shoot, and blow up, then you will go to heaven. That's what they tell you. If you don't, if a woman decides, if she dares, look, I'm not going to do any of this nonsense, I'm going to study accounting, I'm going to a business school, and I'm going to start a company, then she'll be beheaded or stoned to death, right, by these jihadis and by these terrorist organizations. In every sense, Christianity and Jesus behaved exactly the same way. They said, you dogmatically submit to my unreasonable demand, you will go to heaven. Or if I predestined you to go to heaven, you will go to heaven. But your virtuous conduct makes no difference.
Thank you for that. Any other questions? Okay, so then if nobody can think of any other questions, I guess we can wrap it up.
Oh, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
My question is, how, if this is the view that's seen or explained, then how can others not see the same in Vedanta or with Hinduism, in regard to Hinduism?
So if I may,
maybe I'm not making it very clear.
No. Let me try to play back that question. Is your question, do we not see the same things in Vedanta? Whatever we see in Christianity, do we not see the same things in Vedanta? Is that your question?
Or maybe others see the same thing in Vedanta or within Hinduism. Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So your question is, just like I see Christianity and Jesus to be less than flattering and less than edifying, and as actually to be very frank, very harmful and injurious to society, can also somebody see Vedanta as harmful? Is that your question?
Yeah, or see other religions the same way. If everything is like nama rupa or rupa nama or mithya, then maybe part of it is all reflections in different ways of the one reality.
All right, so that's a very interesting question, right? First, to begin with, I'm not a follower of Vedanta. Okay, so I'm not going to defend Vedanta here. But regardless, I'm familiar with Vedanta, right? I've studied that. I'm familiar with it. So now there are very fundamental differences. So and Vedanta, once again, even Advaita Vedanta does not say, what it does is it divides the world into the levels of Paramarthika and Vyavaharika, right? And in Vyavaharika, it still expects you to follow. The Vyavaharika is what defines the realm of material world in which we all live. It still expects you to fulfill all of your duties to society, to family. You have to go through, pursue all the purushartha. You have to practice dharma, and you have to earn wealth. You have to study. You have to get married, and in fact, that's why you even have that that debate between Mishra and Shankara. There is the question that you have not experienced karma, right? And Shankara is made to go and then experience it, and then he comes back. He experienced sex for some time, and he comes back to debate. So all of these are very integral parts of even Advaita Vedanta system, right? And now the area where one may disagree is there a moksha or not, and one may disagree, right? But none of that is can be equated with what you see in Christianity. So Christianity, so when you take Hindu systems like Vedanta on the one hand, what they say is, they say here is your material world, right, and here is how we should live, and that is subject to reason. Okay, you can that's the reason we wrote numerous Dharma Shastra, right? There is not a single Dharma Shastra text, but we have dozens of those that were written over a period of time, or millennia, and all of those are repeatedly examined, questioned, and critiqued, and then we follow. So in other words, Hinduism allows you to shape your life according to a reasonable inquiry. That's why we have the system of pramana, and based on that we come up to a conclusion. This is not the case in Christianity. In Christianity, you cannot ask questions. Okay, and in Christianity, you have to dogmatically obey whatever is said in the Bible, and even if it is completely self-contradictory, there's nothing you can do. You cannot challenge it because it's the word of God. Then second difference is, when you look at any of the Hindu traditions, what happens if you do not follow jnana, right? If you do not follow, the teachings of Adi Shankara, you will not go to hell. Nothing will happen to you. Okay. In fact, you may not attain mukti, right? And you may not go to, that nirvikalpa samadhi status and all of that stuff. So in Hinduism, you don't pay a price for not falling in line with an ideological system. In Christianity, you pay a price. If you do not accept Jesus as you burn in hell for eternity. So these two are very fundamental differences. So while in principle the methodology I have used is not only applicable to Christianity, it can be applied to any religion. The inference you will get would be diametrically opposite when you examine Christianity with my methodology versus when you examine a Hindu system of thought with my methodology. Did I answer your question?
Yes. I guess, can you explain it in context to any other religion then, with like either Buddhism or Judaism?
So can I also make a brief interjection and add to what Kalavai just mentioned about the difference between like Vedanta and Christianity? So as you know, very, very rightly suggested that in our tradition there's no dogmatic acceptance of faith, and even Adi Shankaracharya writes in his commentaries that even if 100 Vedas declare that fire is cold, reject the Vedas, because you have to go with the pramana, which is your sense organs at this point. Similarly, even Vidyaranya says that if you hear something good from a parrot, which is also called Shuka, similarly just as the name of the Acharya, then you should accept that, and if the Acharya says something wrong, you should reject the Acharya. The other thing is that unlike Christianity, there are internal consistencies within all Hindu darshanas. So internally, each of them are consistent, even if they may disagree with one another. And this is on grounds of logic, metaphysics, ontology, and epistemology. Each of these are developed systems within the Sanatana dharmic traditions. Whereas if you look at Christianity itself, there are many glaring fallacies, logically or otherwise. So if one has to pick Christianity apart, one need not look even outside of Christianity in order to do so.
Absolutely, yeah. And then the other question is, is the other question, if I were to play back, is it that can I use my methodology to examine other religions like Buddhism or Islam or anything, or Judaism? Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. The answer is yes. Okay. You can examine not only a religious ideology or a doctrinal system, you can even examine a political ideology using my methodology. Okay. Because this is a methodology which is based on pramana. Okay, which is a very traditional Hindu approach to evaluating knowledge systems and determining the nature of reality. That's what I have done here. And in my book, the primary focus is on Christianity. However, I do examine and reject a lot of premises which are Judaic in nature, because Christianity borrows many of those from Judaism, and I examine and I reject those as well. Even though I do not focus on that part, I focus more on the Christian part of the ideological system. Now, the same can be very well applied to Islam also, or you can apply the same to Buddhism. However, the outcomes would be very different. So if you take, for example, Islam or Christianity or Judaism, these are what I would call systems of in-group morality coupled with out-group hostility. Okay, this is a concept which comes from evolutionary biology and sociobiology. So this is observed in a lot of organisms, not just human beings, even in birds and other animals, and some of the mammals too, where what they do, they will form a group, right? A group of birds will flock together, and then they will protect each other, right? And they will cut a lot of slack. They'll be very lenient towards each other, but they'll be extremely hostile towards another flock, which is considered an outsider. This is true of troops of primates. This is true of schools of mammals, etc. Every one of them, they do that. So and a deed, because they are hostile towards the outgroup, and then whatever they do which weakens the outgroup and which strengthens the in-group is welcome. And all the Abrahamic religions, by which I mean Christianity, Judaism and Islam, all of them are systems of in-group morality coupled with out-group hostility. So take Bible as an example. The Bible as an example, where Jesus often would say, he will say, forgive your neighbor, right? And that means forgive those who are your fellow believers, because he also says, don't throw any of these pearls at swine. Okay, so the non-believers are called swine, and in other places he calls non-believers dogs, right? Those who are non-believers, those who are not part of his race, he calls them dogs. You find the similar teachings in Islam too. In Islam, what you find is the Quran and the Hadiths, they teach that when you go to war, you can butcher the men who are non-Muslims, right? Those who are non-believers, and you can take their women as sex slaves, and then you can ransom them, you can barter them, you can trade them. And Muhammad himself did that. Okay, he would ransom a woman for 400 dirham. Okay, after killing her husband, her father, everyone in cold blood, he would be ransoming them. So whereas you can apply the same methodologies to Buddhism, but you will come up with a diametrically opposite conclusion. In the case of Abrahamic religions, you will conclude that these are either psychotic systems or extremely harmful systems, or both. In the case of Buddhism, you may agree or disagree with some of those. Like with some of the pramana, you may disagree. For example, if I were to examine Buddhism through the prism of Lokayata, through the prism of the Lokayata school, then I would say, why at all do I have to accept something like nirvana, right? I don't see any evidence for nirvana, so I'll reject it. But I can agree with a lot of other things in the writings of Nagarjuna, Ashwagosha and many others, which are perfectly compatible with reason, right? And the same with something like Vedanta, with any other school. So applying my methodology to Hindu, Buddha, Jaina Darshana, you may agree with a lot of things because they are compatible with reason and they stand the scrutiny of reason. Whereas when you apply the same things to Abrahamic religions like Christianity, Islam and Judaism, those religions fail the scrutiny of reason.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Okay, then I suppose. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm being the only dialogue person here. How did you come upon this journey? Like, what led you to this?
Sure. I was kind of explaining that before you joined, I think, but a quick recap. I have been writing on subjects related to Dharma for more than 15, 16 years now. Okay, I have written a lot of blogs. I have contributed to anthologies, both in print and in electronic format. I have been doing that for more than 15 years, and I have also written about Christianity for well over 10 years, though I've been referencing a lot of that even before that. So, but the main motive for me to do that was I'm a follower, I'm a student of the Sitaram Goyal and Coinrod L's school of thinking, right, which emphasizes a lot on reason, knowledge, and truth, and not in advocating something because it is populist. So I'm a big follower of that school, and hence I thought it's overdue, a book which leverages all the cutting-edge findings of neuroscience, psychology, linguistics, philology, and reason itself, right? and to examine Christianity is long overdue, because the last books on the subject were written from the Hindu side were written from Goyal in the 80s and Coin Roddles in the 90s, and hence a book was long overdue, and hence I got to write this.
Thank you.
Most welcome.
Anybody else? Yeah, Uttanji, go ahead.
Yeah. My question is, if Jesus was probably psychotic, how far so much knowledge is there in Bible? And suppose, and there is a sentence Jesus say, "I am a son of God." The same sentence was interpreted by another writer. Let's say Jesus has expressed the sentence because he was in union with the God, in union with the oneself. Can you clarify this?
Sure. So let me play back your question. Your question is, I think, twofold. The first question is, so if Jesus was psychotic, are there any good or valuable teachings in Christianity? That's your first question. And second question is, how do we interpret the statement of Jesus that I am one with God? And so that's your second question. Am I correct? All right. I assume I take the silence for yes. And then starting with the first one, are there any good teachings or any valuable teachings in Christianity? Okay. So there was this great American thinker, Thomas Jefferson. Okay. He started exploring this question right in the beginning. He found so much of horrible things in the Bible. Okay. He goes through the Bible end to end, and then he finds so many horrible things. And then he sets out on a mission to only summarize those teachings in the Bible which are good, and everything else he leaves out. And as a result, he comes up with a Bible. It's called the Jefferson Bible, and that's only 19 or 20 pages long. Okay, and everything else is hateful, rubbish, and totally nonsensical. Right? He leaves out everything else. So the Bible, which is a big voluminous text for the Christians, has shrunk to 19 or 20 pages for Thomas Jefferson. So when I set out to write the book, I started with the mission. Can I examine this Bible, Thomas Jefferson's Bible, and prove that there is not a single page which is worthy, right? In other words, to confirm Ambrose Bierce's word that the only problem with the Holy Bible is that it has far too many pages between the two covers. Okay, in other words, Bierce thought that there is nothing worthy in the book, right? And I wanted to evaluate these two opposite points, right? One of Thomas Jefferson, who thought probably there are 19-20 pages of worthy stuff in the Bible, and Ambrose Bierce, who thought there was none. So I take all the teachings, which are considered by most people, Christians as well as non-Christians, to be great teachers. All of those one by one, in depth, and then I prove, and then I decisively argue that none of those teachings is a good teaching, and none of those teachings is valuable, and none of those teachings has any relevance to the world today. Okay, and it had no relevance to the world even then. Okay, and in other words, I conclude that there is not a single good teaching in the Bible. Okay, I explain all of these things at length in a complete section of the book. So I do this examination, and I also, just to add one more thought to that, these kind of even seemingly good verses were not in the original version of the Bible. The Bible was written over several centuries, and a lot of people felt uncomfortable with the kind of statements where Jesus supports cruel biblical laws, and hence they came up with these kind of stories, and then they attributed them to Jesus. But even those stories, even when you factor in all the interpolations, everything, still they do not redeem Jesus. And the conclusion is there is not a single valuable teaching in all of Christianity. Now to your second question, how do we interpret Jesus' statement that he and God are one, right? So if I am guessing correctly, we are somehow or the other relating that with the various Vedanta thoughts, where Hindus believe that the Paramatman resides within you, and hence you are an aspect of the Paramatman or Ishvara and every one of these things. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Okay, so the big problem is we should never take a statement made within an ideological system and then view it through the lens of our own ideological systems. In other words, if there is a statement within the Bible, then you should interpret it based on based on the Bible, based on the society that wrote it, and based on the ideological framework that was that governs the Christian view of their own religion. And we should not be using the Hindu viewpoint and then project it on Christianity and say, oh, by the way, Jesus should be talking about the Brahman here, and that would be a very erroneous way of approaching it. And Jesus was not doing any of those things, because the best proof of that is, then if Jesus had ever meant that, then he would have said, look, whether you believe in me or not, it's the same Paramatman that resides inside you. Okay, so hence you are all capable of attaining the moksha. You are all capable of self-realizing. He did not say that. He said, it's either my way or the highway. If you accept me as your savior, I will take you to heaven. If you do not, I will torture you for 5 months, I'll kill you, then I'll take you to hell, and I will torture you there for eternity. So that clearly proves Jesus never thought that you are also an aspect of the divine. He never thought that the same Paramatman resides within you. So that's why it's very important to only use reason and their own ways of understanding religions to interpret competing ideology, and not to color it with our own Vedantic or any other perception. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Most welcome.
One last question. In your research, which religion did you find more harmful to Hinduism? Is it Christianity or Islam?
So Christianity and Islam are very similar religions. Okay, there is not much different between the two. Okay, both come out of Judaism, and both have a very similar worldview. They divide the world into the world of believers and the world of non-believers, and both aim to strengthen the believers at the expense of the non-believers. To take one example, in Islam, there is a word called haram, right? Haram means something which is forbidden. Okay, so halal and haram are the two opposite, right? So haram is something forbidden and hence not acceptable. And the word haram actually comes from a root which is in the Bible, and it has a cognate. It's called harem. Okay, harem means something which is forbidden. Okay, and just like you have jihad, they have something called harem warfare in Christianity and in Judaism. In fact, harem warfare is in many orders of magnitude worse than jihad. In jihad, Islam only teaches go and kill all the men or take them as slaves and enslave all the women and turn them into concubines in the Islamic harem. That's why the word harem and harem, haram, they are all related. They are all places forbidden to outsiders. Whereas Christianity and Islam go a step further. What they say is, wage a harem warfare and kill every man, every woman, every child, and even every cattle. Okay, leave nothing, and only usurp their property. Okay, so harem warfare is the mother of all jihads. Okay, I talk about that in the book, and it is worse. And in many ways, I find Christianity to be more dangerous for two reasons. Reason number one, Islam is a bad religion, and it does not try to wear a very sexy makeup. Okay, it comes across as a nasty religion, and everyone is repulsed by that, because when you look at what is the first image that you conjure up in your mind when you think of Islam? It's the ISIS, the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda and others, those long beards, the burqa and all these things, and the first message you get is, wait, this religion subjugates women, this religion subjugates children, this religion has no tolerance, and they throw Hindus out of Pakistan, Kashmir, Bangladesh, everything. So it's an intolerant religion. You get that right. But Christianity evolves. Okay, Christianity has always evolved, and it has acquired greater adaptive fitness. Okay, it speaks the language of modernity. Okay, it's a pretty it has a very evil core, it has a very ugly core, but then it wears a very pretty makeup on top of that. Okay, so hence it looks very sexy on the surface, right? And most people won't be able to figure it out, and hence you do not develop a defense mechanism against Christianity. Okay, that's one reason why it is more dangerous than Islam. And the second reason is, let us hypothetically say that thanks to your iPhone, thanks to internet, thanks to Facebook, everything, in the next few years, all the Islamic societies implode. Okay, and hence Islam gets significantly weakened, and then the Muslims look for an alternative. What alternative would they see? They are not going to embrace Hinduism. They are not going to embrace atheism. They are not going to embrace reason, because they have never been brought up in that kind of worldview. They are going to embrace something which resembles and which looks like Christianity. Sorry, which looks like Islam. And what is that? Christianity. Okay, and even Jesus is someone they are comfortable with, because Jesus is a prophet who is revered and respected within the Islamic tradition. Okay, and hence if they abandon Islam, the next thing they would embrace is Christianity. Okay, and not reason, not Hinduism, and not Buddhism, not any of these things. And hence for these two reasons, I find Christianity to be more dangerous than Islam. And hence, if we were to choose our battles, and if we had to only fight one battle, I would say fight Christianity. And when I say fight Christianity, I'm not saying fight the Christian people. The Christian people themselves are victims of Christianity. My fight is the fight against the ideology of Christianity. My fight is the fight against the person of Jesus. And my fight is aimed to save Christians from Jesus. So hence it's a fight against the ideology and not a fight against the people.
I want to applaud that. Because usually, instead of Jesus saving the Christians, we are saving Christians from Jesus, and I really like how you put that.
Yeah.
Nice way to end.
Yeah.
So I think we've already gone on for 2 hours. If anyone wants to ask questions to Kalavai ji, I'll send you all his Facebook link, and you can add him on to your profile. And so on that note, I think we can conclude.
And from my
Thank you
side,
very
thank
much.
you very
Thanks
much.
again for answering our questions and giving us this long book review.
And thank you very much for organizing this, Prashant ji, and thanks everyone for your very active participation, all the really good questions, and I hope we can make this a more recurring exercise, and we can also deep dive into any one section, get into a lot more details in the future. But thanks a lot, and I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thank you.